Chapter 9 Part 1 Vivian's stomach had growled in irritation as he followed the other boys to their first class. The lunch, responsible for his discomfort, had consisted of a meatloaf as dry as old sponge and some unidentifiable greens and eggs so runny that they dribbled off his plate. As they hurried from the cafeteria to the north wing, up the staircase to the first floor, Token had pulled a blister pack out of his pocket, pushed in one of the plastic bubbles with his thumb, and dropped a large white pill into Vivian's palm. "Chew it," he said, popping another into his own mouth. "You'll feel better." Vivian had hesitated until he saw the other boys doing the same. Then he followed suit. The pill crunched satisfyingly between his teeth and became a silky foam which seemed to lather itself across his tongue. Vivian tasted a chalky mint flavour, and after swallowing several times, felt the irritation in his gut fading. "Antacid," Token grinned. "That's what it's called. I steal it from the infirmary. Maud's cooking won't kill you, but it'd be far easier to swallow this way. Am I right?" Vivian frowned. "You sell it?" Token had laughed. "Everyone needs something to trade." "But if you got caught," Vivian began. Token waved it away. "I've been doing it for years, man. They got plenty of boxes. Don't worry about it." The four of them rounded a corner and made their way along a panelled west wing corridor until they reached the end of a line of kids. There they waited, single file like soldiers, outside a pair of wooden doors which opened at 1 o'clock exactly according to the clock mounted on the doorway. Upon entering, Vivian, who was expecting a regular classroom, was momentarily taken aback by the church-like dimensions of the space. Each wall was lined with huge bookshelves of dark wood and an archetype of every classical English library ever described in literature. The bookshelves themselves rose far beyond conventional height, the mouldings of each cabinet brushing the distant ceiling. A stairway in one corner of the room spiraled up to a flimsy-looking metal gangway which, in turn, ringed the upper half of the chamber and allowed access to the top shelves. The effect of dusty old tomes climbing the walls in a uniform row-upon-row formation had given Vivian the impression that the very walls themselves were made of books. He'd found the idea comforting. Vivian loved to read. His mother had started him on the classics when he had been old enough to listen. By his 5th birthday, he was sailing on the open sea with Captain Ahab, rambling on the open road with Mr. Toad, and tumbling down the rabbit hole behind Alice. He had squinted at some of the leather spines as he shuffled past and felt his hope pop like a balloon. He hadn't been so naive to expect modern-day classics like Crichton, Gaiman, or King. These books were old-looking after all, but where were the greats, he thought? Where was Tolstoy, or Twain, or Tolkien? Where was H.G. Wells, or Jules Verne, or for that matter, Dickens? None of the titles that he read in passing sounded familiar or even interesting. Most of them Vivian guessed to be related to the sciences or philosophy. They were the types of books that it seemed any self-respecting rich person would collect, but never have the gall or enthusiasm or even intelligence to actually read. Pomp and posturing, as his mother would have referred to it. It was with some gloom that Vivian settled in beside Token for his first lesson. Classes had passed with the hours, English becoming science, which in turn became math. Each was resided over by Miss Turrell, one of the two wardens that served as teachers at Murkwater. Miss Turrell was a short woman with a rust-coloured bob pulled back behind her ears and clad collar to knee in an iron-grey one-piece skirt. Her hard, age-lined face was as small as Vivian's, but unfavourably featured eyebrows and nose better suited to a man. Vivian had learned she was a woman of action rather than words because, as Token had pointed out, due to some mishap in her past which left an ugly scar across her throat, Miss Turrell was a mute. She communicated with her class through written commands, hand gestures, and when these failed, savage lashes of her ruler. Most of the time, however, she simply sat behind her desk, peering out at them from behind thick-rimmed glasses which seemed to bulge her eyes like those of a fish. Her students read instructions for her, demonstrated techniques for her, and every one of them never made a sound otherwise. In Miss Turrell's class, silence was the rule. Part 2 It was under this cloud of silence that Vivian hunched behind his desk now, drumming his fingers on the wooden surface and watching wavering shafts of autumn light cut the shadows between the rows of freestanding bookshelves. Boredom gnawed at him, and he glanced over at Token. The dark boy was bent over his math book and didn't notice as Vivian carefully tore a square of paper from the back of his book and scribbled on it. After checking that Miss Turrell's fishy gaze was elsewhere, Vivian slid the message across to Token. "Who is Forest Green?" Token glanced at the message and scowled at Vivian. He quickly looked toward the teacher and then jabbed a finger down at his workbook. Vivian held up his own workbook, displaying that he had already completed the day's section, and shrugged. The dark boy rolled his eyes but took the paper, scribbled something on it under Vivian's question, and then carefully slid it back. "A kid who died long time ago. Vivian frowned at the message, then picked up his pen. Above the word long, he wrote how and drew a stretched question mark beside the stacked words. When he tapped the desk, Token glanced at the question and then shrugged. Vivian thought back to the sitting room and the image on the wall above the fireplace. He pictured the pointed teeth, the tangled hair and claws. He then replayed the dean's reaction to the image in his head.
There is no forest green. There never was.
Picking up his pencil, he scribbled on the paper and slid it over. Gorgon said he wasn't real. Token seized a piece of paper, scribbled on it, and passed it back to Vivian without looking up. He was real. There was a creak of chair legs, and both boys quickly looked up. Over the rows of bent backs, they saw Miss Turrell leaning back and stretching her arms. The pop of her joints was audible in the quiet, and her eyes were closed in relief. Token breathed out a sigh and bent forward, refocusing on his task. Vivian straightened in his seat and craned his neck to peer over the windowsill to his left. The view carried him over the tops of large bushes and down into the leaf-strewn inner courtyard of the orphanage. It was a symmetrical arrangement of crushed stone, manicured lawns, and tiered gardens, all green and apparently unaffected by the brown, twisting rot that plagued the outer grounds. At the centre stood a large fig tree that Vivian recognised from a fruit-picking trip that he had gone on with his old class the year before. He smiled at the memory of a late February afternoon when he and other children had climbed through branches, plucking the ripe greenish-purple figs and biting into the sweet, gritty flesh. It was a memory of warmer days, happier days, and Vivian had almost allowed himself to be carried away with it when he noticed the grating. It was off to one side, almost hidden in the shadow made by the tree's canopy, a rusted, circular grill resting among the fallen leaves. It was difficult to tell from the distance, but Vivian fancied the grating covered a hole roughly a metre across, and he couldn't tell how deep. If the darkness peeking out from between the metal bars was any indication, then it might have been a hole to the centre of the world. More likely, though, he figured, it was a rainwater drain or maybe a part of Murkwater's sewerage system. Then a thought crossed his mind, and he was scribbling again. When he finished, he passed a piece of paper across to Token, who dropped his forehead onto the desk with a groan, but looked at it all the same. If he's dead, why are all the kids afraid of him? Now Token looked at him warily before writing and passing back his answer. He's come back. Vivian stared at the message and felt a crawling in his gut. The message had sprouted 100 new questions. He looked at Token and mouthed, "Come back." Token must have heard him because he nodded without looking up. Again, Vivian's mind conjured up the frightful image from the sitting room, and a surge of excitement crackled through him like energy. "They don't believe that," he thought, looking across at Lewis, who had fallen asleep face down on his workbook, and then at Tank, who was blinking at the pages of his with desperate non-comprehension. "No way," he thought. "They can't believe that. How could they be so calm if they thought it was true?" He scribbled another message and reached over, pushed it right under Token's wide nose. "What about the room today?" Token bared his teeth and scrawled 2 words on it before leaning over to shove it back. "Not now." Vivian huffed at his fringe in frustration. He shuffled his bum backward and the chair shifted beneath him. The legs scraped an inch across the floor, letting out a sharp note as they did. Miss Turrell's head swiveled in their direction, and she stood. Her skirt was so starched that it barely wrinkled with her sharp little movements. Token closed his eyes, his face screwing up in dismay. The teacher was around her desk and bustling up one of the aisles toward them. Vivian slowly covered the note with his workbook and lowered his face to the page. He heard the clip-clop of her approaching heels on the wooden floor and was reminded of a clock ticking, perhaps marking out the last seconds of their lives. "Bastard! Bastard!" Token was mouthing at the pages of his workbook. He kept his head down and continued to write, but Vivian could see that it was meaningless scribbles in the answer spaces. He gave the dark boy a playful nudge in the side and prepared to take the heat when it came. The clip-clop closed in, passing row upon row of silent obedience, then stopped in the aisle beside him. Vivian sensed the teacher standing over them. He fixed a grin on his face that yet again opened his lip and leaked a trail of blood down his chin. Good. If he was going down, then he might as well freak the teacher out doing it. He glanced up. The ruler came down and crashed across the wooden surface of the desk like a bullwhip crack that seemed to shatter the world. The desk, however, did not belong to Vivian and Token, but their neighbours across the aisle. Both children, the boy with old headphones that Vivian had seen earlier, and a girl around the same age, wearing her chocolate brown hair in 2 ponytails, cried out in surprise. The teacher glared at them, her pupils huge and bulging behind their glass lenses. One of her hands shot out with surprising speed and seized the wrist of the boy. He yelped as she pulled his hand up high so all could see the open envelope clutched between his fingers. With a vicious twist from the teacher, the boy yelled in pain and the envelope upended, spilling its contents. A chocolate-colored lock of hair, wrapped in a bow of twine, tumbled to the floor. The teacher's other hand flashed out, seizing the wrist of the girl next to him, and both children were pulled roughly to their feet. As this happened, Vivian noticed that one of the girl's ponytails was shorter than the other. Miss Tara was barely taller than the children she held, but the steely grip of her fingers and the cruel smile on her face spelt imminent doom for both youngsters. She turned on the spot, and without uttering so much as a grunt of effort, dragged them both down the long rows of desks, through the reading lounge, and out of the library door. Their cries echoed into the hallway. Token had been face down on the desk like a French aristocrat ready for the guillotine. Now he rolled his head sideways, his mop of dreadlocks flopping over like an upturned potted palm. He winced at Vivian and mouthed, "Too close." Vivian pushed another piece of paper under his nose. "The room?" For a moment, Token's face went purple with anger, and he seemed to be about to start shouting. But when he saw Vivian's smug grin, he broke into his own smile and extended his middle finger.